Thank you so much for attending my PowerPoint presentation on Fallout's most evil characters explained. First up is Kellogg. Conrad Kellogg is the Institute's primary service operative, a cybernetically enhanced mercenary who opens Fallout 4 by walking into Vault 111, shooting your spouse in the face, and kidnapping your infant son, Sean. That's your introduction to this guy. No build-up, no negotiation, just a bullet to the head of someone who refused to hand over a baby. Pure, ruthless efficiency. And honestly, it sets the tone for everything that follows, because Kellogg is 108 years old at the time of his death, kept alive by synthetic augmentations that have essentially turned him into more machine than man. He's had over a century to refine his approach to problem solving, and his solution to every problem is murder. Now, what makes Kellogg particularly interesting is that unlike most villains in the Fallout franchise, he doesn't have some grand ideology justifying his actions. He's not even building an empire. He's not trying to save humanity through forced evolution. He's not even particularly invested in the Institute's goals. He's just a mercenary who abandoned whatever humanity he had left after losing his own family decades ago. And he's been doing the Institute's dirty work ever since because they pay well and he's good at it. The Institute keeps him around specifically because he's effective at solving problems that their pristine scientists don't want to get their hands dirty with. Need someone kidnapped? Call Kellogg. Need a settlement wiped out? Call Kellogg. Need someone murdered in the cryogenic sleep pod? Well, you get the idea. You're gonna call Kellogg. The beautiful irony here is that Kellogg's entire job is killing people efficiently, yet he makes the single most catastrophic mistake of his career by leaving the sole survivor alive. He even admits later that he knew it was a mistake at the time. Should have killed you when you were on ice, he says, which is really the kind of self-awareness you want to have before you create your own nemesis. But he was cocky enough to assume he could handle some soft pre-war vault dweller if they ever thawed out. Congratulations on that assessment, Kellogg. Truly inspiring. And here's the thing, even Fowler, your own son, who grew up to become director of the Institute, never forgave Kellogg for murdering one of his parents. Fowler deliberately sends Kellogg to Diamond City with the synthetic child version of himself as bait, knowing full well that the sole survivor will eventually track him down and kill him. That's how much of a liability Kellogg became. The cybernetic enhancements that were supposed to make him the Institute's perfect asset just stripped away what little humanity he had left, turning him into a glorified hitman who couldn't even complete a hit properly. Next up is Tenpenny. Alistair Tenpenny is an 80-year-old British entrepreneur who crossed the entire Atlantic Ocean to seek his fortune in the capital wasteland, which already tells you everything you need to know about how screwed up post-nuclear Europe must be. He discovered a pre-war hotel, hired some people to fix it up, and turned it into a Tenpenny Tower, the most exclusive luxury community in the wasteland. And by exclusive, I mean he runs it as a discriminatory enclave that won't allow ghouls anywhere near the property, because apparently surviving nuclear radiation and becoming a zombie is where Tenpenny draws the line on the acceptable neighbors. This is the same guy who wants to detonate a nuclear weapon for aesthetic reasons. But sure, ghouls are the problem. Now, here's where Tenpenny really distinguishes himself in the pantheon of Fallout villains. He wants to nuke the entire town of Megaton, a settlement with dozens of residents, including children, because it's an eyesore that blocks his view of the wasteland. That's it. That's the entire motivation. Not because Megaton poses a threat, not because of some human conflict, but because he doesn't like looking at it from his balcony. He says the lone wanderer 1,000 caps to arm a nuclear bomb sitting in the middle of town, and then he watches the destruction from his penthouse suite while sipping champagne and remarking, "Well done, Mr. Burke. What a grand display of fireworks. I almost wish there was another nuke we could detonate." Let that marinate for a second. This man traveled across an ocean to escape the aftermath of a nuclear war, only to immediately start nuking other settlements because they ruin his view. The cognitive dissonance required to flee nuclear destruction and then actively participate in more nuclear destruction is genuinely impressive. It's like escaping a firehouse and then becoming an arsonist because you don't like your neighbor's curtains. The funniest part is that Tenpenny is actually being manipulated by his assistant, Mr. Burke, who spends weeks putting his plans into motion after Tenpenny made an offhand comment about Megaton being a bit of an eyesore. Tenpenny is senile, alcoholic, and barely in control of his own tower anymore. Burke has taken over most of the day-to-day operations, and Tenpenny doesn't even notice because Burke anticipates his every need. Which means this entire genocide is really Burke's idea, but Tenpenny is so checked out that he just goes along with it. He's the only one of 9 characters in Fallout 3 with a very evil karma, and he achieved it through sheer elderly rich person apathy. When he's not planning to nuke settlements, Tenpenny enjoys a wasteland safari from his balcony, where he randomly snipes at creatures and people at the distance for entertainment. Just a bored old man with a sniper rifle shooting at things because he has nothing better to do. And if you convince him to let ghouls move into the tower, Roy Phillips murders him and stuffs his body in a storage closet, which is probably the most dignified end Tenpenny could have hoped for given his life choices. Next up is Caesar. Edward Solo is a former follower of the Apocalypse, basically a post-apocalyptic Peace Corps volunteer who was sent to study tribal dialects in Arizona and decided to instead become a dictator. He crowned himself Caesar, modeled his entire empire after ancient Rome based on history books he'd read, and proceeded to get almost everything about Roman civilization wrong. But don't worry, his followers don't know that because, well, they're literate and think everything he says comes directly from Mars, the god of war. Which is convenient when you're building a slave empire and need people to behave. You tend to have divine mandate rather than just a library card and delusions of grandeur. Caesar's legion operates by conquering tribes, stripping them of their cultural identities, forcing young men to become soldiers, and designating women as breeding stock. That's the actual in-game terminology. The primary value of women in Caesar's legion is to produce more legion members, though they're also used for various other tasks when they're not busy being assigned to males at Caesar's discretion. It's a totally totalitarian dictatorship built on the principle that individuals have no value beyond their utility to the state, which Caesar frames as necessary for long-term stability. He calls it Hegelian dialectics. Everyone else calls it slavery, with a philosophy degree. Now the Legion deliberately commits atrocities to terrorize their enemies. Crucifixions are standard practice for anyone who resists. They use rape as a weapon to break civilian populations. They employ children as traps and soldiers to demoralize opponents. They erasure every conquered culture completely. No tribal identities, no personal histories, just Caesar's vision of Rome imposed at gunpoint. By 2281, Caesar had absorbed 86 tribes into his legion through this method, creating what he believed is a unified empire. In reality, he's creating a massive pressure cooker of resentment held together entirely by his personality cult and the fear of crucifixion. The beautiful irony here is that Caesar spends the entire game dying from a brain tumor that he can't cure without the courier's help. The mighty son of Mars, brought low by a medical condition that any competent doctor could diagnose. If you don't save him, he just dies, and the Legion immediately descends into civil war over succession, proving that his entire empire was built on nothing but his ability to convince people that he was special. And if you do save him, he still loses at Hoover Dam to the NCR, the Democratic Republic he consistently and constantly mocked as weak and insufficient. Turns out that allowing conquered peoples to retain their identities and giving citizens actual rights makes for a more stable society than slavery and terror. Extraordinary, I know. Caesar genuinely believes he's creating a new civilization that will surpass both the NCR and the old world. He's not. He's creating a slave army with Latin words spray painted on it. The real Caesar built roads, aqueducts, and a system of laws that lasted centuries. Edward Solo built a death cult that collapses the moment he's not around to threaten people. That's what happens when you base your understanding of Rome entirely on military history and completely ignore the civic institutions that actually made Rome successful. Next up is Elijah. Father Elijah was an elder of the Brotherhood of Steel, which in Brotherhood hierarchy is essentially the highest rank you can achieve. He was a genius with technology, able to understand how machines work just by looking at them, and he rose to the scribe to elder, despite that being virtually unheard of in Brotherhood culture. And then he led his chapter into a catastrophic defeat at Helios I against the NCR, abandoned his people mid-battle, and spent the next several years wandering the wasteland, looking for technology powerful enough to exact revenge on everyone who wronged him, which is definitely the appropriate response to losing a military engagement, become a genocide suicidal maniac obsessed with pre-war superweapons. Of course, Elijah's obsession eventually led him to the Sierra Madre, a pre-war casino that was supposed to be the pinnacle of luxury, but never opened due to the bombs dropping. The casino is surrounded by the Cloud, a toxic red mist that kills you if you breathe it for too long, and protected by holograms that are immune to conventional weapons. Elijah saw this and thought, perfect, I can weaponize this to kill everyone in the Mojave and rule over the survivors with explosive collars and indestructible holograms. Because nothing says stable post-apocalyptic society like ruling through constant threat of decapitation via explosive necklace. But here's the problem. Elijah couldn't open the Sierra Madre's vault alone, so he kidnapped people, fitted them with the explosive collars that detonate if they disobeyed or strayed too far from each other, and forced them to risk their lives breaking into the casino for him. If they failed, the collars exploded. If they succeeded but weren't useful anymore, Elijah killed them anyway. He went through numerous heist teams this way before a courier arrives, and he experimented on prisoners at Little Yangtze to perfect the collar technology. One of those prisoners was Christine, a Brotherhood knight sent to stop him, who also happened to be the girlfriend of Veronica, Elijah's former student who saw him as a father figure. When Christine tracked Elijah down, he had her dragged to the medical facility where she was subject to the lobotomy via electrodes, leaving her unable to read or write. Her vocal cords were later torn out by a malfunctioning autodoc. This is what Elijah does to people who care about him, unfortunately. If you actually help Elijah succeed in Dead Money's alternate ending, he weaponizes the Cloud and releases it above and across the Mojave into the NCR territory, killing millions of people. The wasteland becomes uninhabitable for years. Nobody sets foot in the region because Elijah has turned it into a toxic death zone ruled by a mad scientist with a god complex. But the best ending is trapping Elijah in the vault he was so desperate to open. And the Sierra Madre's tagline is "Begin again, let go." But Elijah could never let go of his defeat, his pride, or his need for revenge, so he gets sealed in a vault filled with gold bars he can't carry out, slowly dying while mumbling to himself over the radio signal. The genius who could jury-rig Tesla cannons and reprogram vending machines to produce ammunition gets defeated by force fields he can't disable. Let that sink in. Next up is Braun. Dr. Stanislaus Braun is the vault tech scientist who invented the Garden of Eden creation kit, served as director of the Societal Preservation Program, and was responsible for designing the social experiments for each individual vault in the Fallout universe, which means that every horrific vault experiment you've encountered across the entire franchise, from frozen families being forced to watch their loved ones die, to children becoming genetic harvesting farms, to cloning disasters that created an entire population of a psychopath named Gary, can be traced back to decisions made by this one German scientist from Bavaria. But we're not here to talk about his greatest hits across the wasteland. Not today. We're here to talk about Vault 112, where Braun served as overseer and decided to trap 85 people in virtual reality pods for over 200 years while he tortured them for entertainment. Now, Vault 112 was built with geothermal power, maintained by caretaker robots, and equipped with special stasis pods that could keep residents alive indefinitely while tracking their stress levels and vital signs. The experiment was supposed to test virtual reality as a means of preserving humanity in perfect simulated utopias, and for a while, Braun actually ran it as intended, creating pleasant worlds where Vault residents could live out their ideal lives. But then he got bored, so he started killing them repeatedly in various creative ways, and then resurrecting them with their memories wiped so they wouldn't remember being murdered hundreds of times over 2 centuries. In this simulation, Braun appears as a little girl named Betty, which is exactly the kind of psychological horror you'd expect from someone inspired by the Twilight Zone episode It's a Good Life. You know, the one where an omnipotent child terrorizes adults. Some residents received special attention. Martha Simpson was given scurvy, so she died slowly, painfully on a loop. Timmy Newbaum was devoured by a shark over and over because Braun enjoyed his screams. When James, the lone wanderer's father, arrives at Vault 112 seeking Braun's help with Project Plurity, Braun turns him into a dog just out of spite, just because he can. That's the level of petty sadism we're working. The only resident who remembers the truth is Old Lady Diths, whose memory block was accidentally disabled when a scientist named Pinkerton broke into the vault and stole a chip from one of the pods. She tries to warn the other residents that they're trapped in a virtual nightmare, but nobody believes her because Braun has conditioned them to dismiss her as senile. Anyone who might have believed her gets memory wiped during the next massacre. It's a perfect system of psychological torture. When the lone wanderer enters Tranquility Lane, Braun forces them to either torture the residents for his amusement or activate a failsafe that kills everyone permanently. The failsafe exists because even Braun feared eternal boredom, but he programmed himself as exempt from it, which means he's trapped in his own simulation forever. He can never die, never leave, and never experience anything except the world he has tragically created. He built himself a perfect VR immortality system and uses it to play Serial Killer Simulator for 200 years because he ran out of things to do. This is the man who designed the framework for every Vault experiment in the Fallout universe. Let that sink in. Next up is the Master. The Master is the main antagonist of the original Fallout and the founder of Unity, an organization dedicated to the forced evolution of humanity into super mutant. Before he became a grotesque fusion of flesh, metal, and organic matter barely recognizable as human, the Master was a man named Richard Gray who fell into a vat of forced evolutionary virus while exploring the Mariposa military base. He spent months slowly merging with computers, other creatures, and the base's infrastructure, his body mutilating into something that transcended individual identity. What emerged was the Master, a highly intelligent, immensely powerful entity with psychic abilities who decided that humanity's only hope for survival in this post-nuclear wasteland was to forcibly mutate everyone into super mutant course. Now, the Master's plan operates on simple premise. Super mutants are stronger, tougher, and more resilient than baseline humans. Therefore, converting all humans into super mutants creates a unified species capable of surviving the harsh realities of a wasteland. He calls this Unity, a world without conflict based on race, nationality, or tribal identity, because everyone would be the same superior species. It's a beautiful vision, really. The only problem is that the forced evolutionary virus only produces super successful mutants in 1 out of every 6 attempts. The rest becomes mindless monsters or die horribly during the transformation process. But don't worry, the Master accounts for this by specifically targeting prime normals, humans with minimal radiation exposure, like Vault dwellers, because they have the highest success rates. To facilitate this plan, the Master creates an army of super mutants and sends them across California, kidnapping wastelanders and Vault dwellers to bring them back for dipping into the FEV vats. Thousands of people are abducted, forcibly mutated, and either join the Master's army or become the mindless mutants that terrorize the region. And here's what makes the Master genuinely terrifying. He actually believes he's saving humanity. This isn't some power-mad dictator who knows he's evil and doesn't care. This is a highly intelligent entity who has thought through his plan, considered the alternatives, and concluded that forced evolution is humanity's only viable path forward. His charisma and intellect are so compelling that in universe, his argument actually seems reasonable to some people. But the Master made one critical oversight. Super mutants are sterile, cannot reproduce, which means his perfect unity leads to the extinction of humanity within a single generation, not its salvation. If you present him with evidence of this, proof from his own research logs that super mutants cannot have children, the Master realizes his entire plan dooms the species he was trying to save. In one ending, he commits suicide in despair, destroyed by the revelation that everything he's done for decades was not just pointless, but actively genocidal. And another, he refuses to accept it and fights to the death to preserve his vision. The Master created a master race that can't reproduce. Extraordinary, I know. Didn't think to check whether his superior species could actually perpetuate itself before kidnapping thousands of people and forcibly mutating them. You'd think that would be one of the first questions you'd ask when designing a plan to save humanity through mandatory genetic modification, but apparently the Master was too busy merging with computer systems and developing psychic powers to consider basic biology. Unfortunate. Next up is Cook. Cook is a high-ranking member of the Fiends in Fallout New Vegas, and one of the only 5 characters in the game to have a very evil karma. The Fiends are already a gang of chem-addicted raiders who terrorize the New Vegas area, murdering and cannibalizing anybody they encounter. And so the fact that Cook stands out among them as uniquely depraved should tell you everything you need to know. Cook is a rapist, a pyromaniac, and ironically, a genuinely talented chef whose signature dish is apparently quite useful in the game's survival mode. According to captured fiends interrogated by the NCR, he's legitimately good at cooking, which is perhaps the only positive thing anyone has ever said about Cook, and somehow makes everything else worse. Cook wields a flamethrower and uses it on his victims either before or after raping them, depending on his mood. This is his signature. Major Daughtry of the NCR offers a bounty on Cook, specifically because he raped Corporal Betsy, one of the major snipers. Pretty Sarah, a woman you can meet at Aerotech Office Park, is covered in burn scars from when Cook raped her and then set her on fire as his way of assigning his work, as one NPC describes it. If you're either a female courier and talk to a driver Neppy, another fiend leader, he'll warn you to never be alone with Cook. Even the other fiends themselves, terrible people who engage in torture, murder, and cannibalism, are repulsed and disgusted by Cook's actions. In one quest, you can discover a ledger showing that Cook purchased an entire family of slaves from 2 dealers, a mother, a teenage son, and 2 teenage daughters. He tied them all up, burned the son alive in front of the women, forcing them to watch before doing whatever else he planned for them. The game doesn't elaborate further, but given Cook's documented behavior, you can fill in the blanks by yourself. The cut dialogue that didn't make it into the final game apparently made him even more depraved, which means what we got is the sanitized version that Obsidian felt comfortable shipping. Now here's what makes Cook particularly inexcusable even by Wasteland standards. His chem of choice is Mentats, a drug that temporarily increases intelligence and makes users more aware of their surroundings. Most fiends abuse Psycho and Jet, drugs that make you violent, aggressive, and mentally unstable. Cook uses the drug that makes him smarter and more conscious of his actions. He can't even claim drug-induced insanity as an excuse. He does what he does with full awareness and clarity of thought, which somehow makes it worse. Cook has a pet Branham named Queenie, and if you or any enemy kills her, he goes berserk and attacks everything around him in a murderous rage. This is the only thing Cook seems to care about. The relationship between Cook and Queenie is heavily implied to be questionable at best, and when she dies, Cook doesn't sound grief-stricken. He sounds excited that he gets to kill everyone responsible. Major Daughtry notes that Cook either rapes or burns every living thing he can get his hands on, and remarks that Cook apparently smells terrible, even by Wasteland standards, which raises the question of how the other fiends let him touch their food. In a franchise full of raiders, slavers, and cannibals, Cook stands out as uniquely vile. No ideology, no grand plan, no tragic backstory that justifies anything. Just sadism for sadism's sake. The guy whose nickname is Cook because he's good at cooking might have the least catchy serial killer name in history, yet somehow it fits him perfectly. Next up is Barb Howard. Barb Howard is the Vault-Tec executive from the Fallout television series, and she is the mastermind behind dropping the nuclear bombs that ended the world, not as a response to external threats, not as part of mutually assured destruction, but as a deliberate business strategy to ensure Vault-Tec's long-term profitability. The seemingly perfect wife, mother, and corporate executive was the actual harbinger of destruction. And it was ultimately Barb's idea to coordinate with competing corporations to trigger nuclear war so they could profit from the destruction of the human race. Her exact words. Good business, she calls it. Mr. House, CEO of Arabco Industries, describes it as having a lot of earning potential. These are the people who decided the fate of the human civilization. Bob calls a meeting with representatives from Robco, Westech, and other major corporations competing with Vault-Tec in the defense and technology sectors. Her pitch is simple. Instead of waiting for nuclear war to maybe happen someday, why not control the bombs drop? Vault-Tec has built the vaults, they have the infrastructure, and if they can coordinate the timing of nuclear apocalypse with their competitors, they can ensure maximum return on investment. The other executives don't reject this proposal. They don't call security. They just sit there listening to a PowerPoint presentation about optimizing quarterly earnings by killing everyone on Earth. And they think, yeah, I should get into that. The head of the Forced Evolutionary Virus Project, The same FEV that would eventually create super mutants explicitly agrees that securing a Vault-Tec's investment justifies genocide. This isn't some rogue madman acting alone. This is a boardroom full of executives from multiple corporations nodding along to the idea that deliberately triggering nuclear war is sound business strategy. Barb even frames it as using the Fallout franchise's tagline, "War never changes." But in her mouth, it's not a philosophical observation about human nature. It's a shareholder value statement. If war is inevitable, she reasons, they might as well profit from it rather than wait for someone else to start it. Every Vault experiment, every atrocity in Fallout lore, every character suffering across every game in the franchise traces back to decisions made in this very same meeting. Stanislaus Braun's torture simulations in Vault 112, approved in a boardroom, the forced evolution experiments that created super mutants, signed off by executives looking at projected returns, the cloning disasters, the psychological experiments, the vaults designed to fail catastrophically. These are all part of Vault-Tec's research portfolio, authorized by people wearing suits and discussing profit margins. And here's what makes Bob Howard the most evil character in the entire Fallout franchise. She's not a mad scientist. She's not a wasteland warlord. She's not a mutated monster or a sadistic torturer. She's just a business executive in a suit who attended a meeting and made a decision that killed billions of people. The banality of corporate evil distilled into a single character. She goes home to her family, she smiles at her daughter, she maintains the facade of normalcy while actively planning the end of human civilization, because it's good for business. The Fallout universe exists because a woman sat in a boardroom and decided that triggering nuclear apocalypse was the optimal path to competitive advantage. Every dead body, every mutated creature, every failed Vault experiment, every tragedy across 200 years of post-nuclear wasteland can be traced directly back to Barb Howard and her colleagues deciding that genocide was an acceptable quarterly earnings strategy. In conclusion, the Fallout franchise features villains ranging from personal sadists to corporate architects of apocalypse, and you should absolutely play them. If you enjoyed this PowerPoint presentation, I made others, and you should absolutely check them out. Peace on planet Earth.